you guys only have 3 rounds remaining. Um, it's going by fast. It always does. Um, I'm still hopeful. Here we've completed the 5th round, and I'm still hopeful that at least one student team thumps on the computer team. I'm hopeful, and I'm remain optimistic that that will happen, but we'll see. So let's go back and let's go take a look at round 4 first and the assignment that we had from round 4. Again, I've corrected round 3. I'm going to tell you, with the exception of one, I think you're a little disappointed in the effort. I understand some of these questions are kind of new and difficult, perhaps. One, maybe you guys want to get a discussion thing going or something and talk about them a little bit. That's fine, as long as you're just not copying each other's work. Two, if you're really confused, maybe you ought to ask your instructor. Okay. And 3, it's the disappointing part is sometimes when, and granted I've expanded on it, but I've asked several questions now, probably 3 or 4, about the potential versus the actual. And while each time I've added something, I've fully demonstrated it in my conversations here, and I've also put it when I'm correcting your stuff, I'm adding the sheet, my answers to those particular questions. And so even though you might not, I can see you failing the last part of those assignments, but to fail the first parts of those assignments seems a little odd. So I don't know. Again, a little disappointment on my part. So I'm hoping that you guys really pick it up for the last few rounds here. Okay, round 4. Let's just look at the homework from round 4. First one was, why did Andrews have negative contribution margins for its product, acre and atom? And I said, note, its prices exceeded the material and labor costs. So, let's go take a look at that. So, acre and atom, right? So a $20 price, for example, here it's material and labor cost was only $4 to $10, $11, just short of $11, right? So it had a $9 margin there. Well, why did it end up having a negative contribution margin? There's and the same would be true of atom, right? $30 price and just about a $20, 19 something dollar deal, and a negative contribution margin, even though that's a positive margin there. And I kind of looked ahead a little bit, and some of you kind of got that. And carrying costs, certainly the labor and material were a little higher, but not much higher than other teams. So carrying, and I'd already kind of excluded those from up there. So certainly carrying costs would be the answer, right? They had really high, inventory levels in those two products, especially relative to the product cost and whatnot. They had high inventory here. They still eked out a positive contribution margin. The other thing, and I didn't put it in there, but contribution margin would also go back to what the costs were from the round before if there was inventory left over. And I think that was the case with Andrews. And so, there could have been some of that the variable cost might have been higher from the time before. So 2, what factors contributed to Ebb's 53% contribution margin in the low end? There's only 2 things, right? Prices and variable costs are the only things that can go into that, and their price, actually, it was relatively low. And I put that in there. It wasn't the lowest, but it was low compared to the others. But then I broke down the variable costs, right? Their labor costs were low because of HR investment. I think that their productivity was up over 110%, if I'm not mistaken. Lots of investment in automation. They were up to 9 on the automation, and lots of investment in TQM. Okay, those 3 things certainly helped bring the variable cost down. And then the material cost side, the TQM again, they had a low MTBF. Okay, and they also had a relatively old product, and so the age of that product, the older a product gets, the less expensive the components are, at least relatively speaking. They're less expensive. So I got fairly specific on here. I kind of glanced at the answers that some of you done. I hadn't corrected them yet, but again, maybe not all that specific, and so read and add specificity where you can. Okay, I don't think I'll ever get too mad if you get too much specifics, as long as they're applicable. 3, what are the reasons for acres poor sales in the low end? Almost completely out of position. In the low end, if we go and look at the whatever that little chart thing's called, the perceptual map, yeah, acre, look at that, it's right there, okay, on the dotted line, so it's just about outside of it, so that's bad. Price, so acres price in the low end, oops, traditional, there's low, and you come down here to acre priced at $20, while there's a couple that are higher than that sold better, 21, but $20 relative to these ones, okay, is really quite high. Okay, it's no wonder that those 4 products sold pretty well. And then lastly, virtually no marketing. Okay, and the marketing is easy to see. You just come acre, look at that, almost no promotional budget, and certainly that doesn't hardly qualify at all for sales budget. I don't know if that might have been a typo or whatever by the team, but certainly almost no marketing there. 4, Erie spent $13.55 million on TQM. What were the short-term implications for profit? In other words, what were the positive and/or negative impacts? So I'm trying to give you a hint maybe how to set this up. And again, I looked at a few answers, and nothing special yet. But numbers could be used to answer this question. I might consider bonus points, but aren't absolutely necessary. Just be sure to explain your answers fully. So what are some of the negatives? Well, there's an immediate deduction in income, right? And there's a required increase in capital is what that should say. Which either equity or loan, which increases the cost, one or the other, or decreases the decrease possibly earnings per share if it's capital, right? But a loan would certainly increase cost in interest cost, right? Okay, so there are some negatives there, certainly. The positives are, and they're huge. You got a $13.5 million that comes not quite off the bottom line, but pretty close. Okay, that's a huge amount of money that you're expending, but at the same time you get to deduct that from your taxes, right? And so that's a tax deductible thing, which will lower your taxes, which can be good. It's going to lower the variable costs, and glancing through some of yours, you correctly pointed out that it lowers the labor cost and the material cost, and that's true. And it lowers other costs as well, including the administrative and R&D, and it also increased demand. And those are things that are just given to you, right down here in the TQM, right? So this shouldn't have been, a huge surprise or hugely difficult, because it really just talks about those things down there, the positive impacts, right? Now, if you wanted to roughly figure out some amounts, look at that. It's about 5.5% of variable costs, material and labor. You're going to have some carrying costs, so it may not be, this may not be perfect, but if we come up here and we look at their total variable cost, labor, material, Erie's was about 140. How much inventory did Erie have? Not much. Okay, so virtually all that cost is labor and material, and they saved about 5.5%. That's about $7 million right there. So in the first year, okay, they spent $13.5 million, which is tax deductible, and they recouped about $7.5 million just in lower material and labor costs. So they recouped half of it just in those. And then they had lower administrative costs. Okay, and admin costs, Erie could look that up themselves. I don't think you guys have the ability to look up what the other administrative costs are. They're relatively low. I want to say that administrative costs run a few $1 million, and so they might have saved, if we scroll way back down, sorry, but do that TQM. They saved about 5% of that, and so they probably saved several $100,000 there. Reduction in R&D cycle time. Okay, that's huge. That probably plays some into this demand increase, because you're maybe out of the two might be mutually exclusive, but certainly if you're able to push your products to the front a little bit more because of the reduction in the R&D cycle time, you're going to improve the demand for those. But 6% increase in demand, if your total sales are 200 million, something like that, that's huge. That's $12 million more in demand, and if your contribution margin is 30%, boom, there's another 3 million. So mathematically, if I were to look at it, $13.5 million investment here in this 1 year, while that shows up, it shows up as a huge amount. I want to come up and show you that on the income statement. Okay, it's just a huge amount. It's right here, right? Other fees, write-offs, TQM, and bonus. Okay, boom. So you've got sales, your variable cost, depreciation, SG&A, and then your other. Okay, and like Chester didn't spend any; they had a negative other, but boom, that's huge. I mean, if you added that 13.5 million back in, you would be up to over 30 million here in EBIT. Okay. But your taxes would also be quite a bit higher. Interest, I don't know if that would change much, right? Okay, but you can't really do that because you would not have had the same variable costs. You would not have had the same sales. You'd have not had the same things. And so, is it a wash the first year? Maybe not quite a wash the first year, but by subsequent years, I'll bet you get your money back within a year and a half or less, probably, in terms of an investment in TQM. Okay, so it's not strictly a short-term investment. So let's go take a look at round 5 and see what happened. Again, I'm kind of optimistic that maybe we'll get at least one team that might successfully kick the butt of the computer team. So look at their ROS. Yeah, okay. ROE 21.8% for Team Erie. All the other student teams were negative, and Ferris, the computer team, had a positive, but only 9%. Sales, Ferris had the highest sales, but EBIT, Erie, okay, and then profits, Erie had more. Cumulative profit, I don't get too worried about. SG&A to sales, that's a big number. It's 10%, which is high, especially when you're dealing with 250 million in sales. They spent a lot, okay, but obviously it was fairly effective, the spending. And then contribution margin, look at that, the highest, and not just by a little bit. Next closest was still about 6% behind. And so you're talking about huge dollars based on that contribution margin. It's one of the reasons I score the contribution margin in my score sheet. And I score it high because it's that important, right? Figuring out ways to get a few extra percent. And I'll tell you that by historical standards, 34.4% is low. And Erie may push this up higher. I would assume they will before the end of the game. But by historical standards at this point, that's kind of relatively low, actually. All right. So we see earnings per share. Erie was successful there. Again, all the student-run teams were negative. Chester barely so. Stock prices, yeah. Erie's made a nice turnaround. We see the computer or the student teams are either hanging at the bottom or, for the most part, on their way. Other than Erie and Ferris, kind of heading up there, but it looks like they might be peaking too. We'll see. So debt. Chester took on some debt. Erie, big time debt. Huge debt. Cash flow I like to look at, again, go through it kind of slow. You might see some big changes in inventory, those types of things. We see teams that reduced inventory, and that's why it was a positive to the cash flow. Baldwin, big time. Erie, Some of the other ones reduced inventory quite a bit. Plant improvements, wow, look at that. So in spite of the fact that Erie apparently did pretty well this round in profit and stuff, still invested 48, nearly $50 million in plant improvements. So if I were their competitor, I'd probably want to know what they're spending their money on. Is it going to continue to improve their contribution margin, or they maybe gearing up so that they can sell more products and take more market share in other segments? So long-term debt, we see some teams actually taking some long-term debt. We still see teams selling common stock. For the life of me, I've tried to hint about that throughout the game. It's getting late enough in the game that I'll quit hinting about it. But but selling stock is let me put it this way. In most of my classes, and a lot of you should have had classes from me before, I always ask which is cheaper, debt or equity, and the answer is debt's cheaper always. Okay. And so the only time I would sell stock is if I had exhausted my ability to borrow. Okay. And even then, the only time I would sell stock is if it were a part of a long-range plan, if my investments were a part of a long-range plan. So in this game, the only time I'd even consider selling stock would be at the start of a game, if I were going to invest hugely, okay, into my plant, say for automation or for something like that. Otherwise, I wouldn't even consider selling stock. And in Chester's case, look at that. They sold $10 million in stock and they got $35 million in cash. And so it's just added to their equity, which makes it more difficult to have a return on equity, et cetera, right? So we got some debt, retirement of current debt. Okay, that's automatic. Got a couple emergency loans and big emergency loans. Okay. Net change in cash position, some positive there. Look at Digby. Perfect job of managing cash. Man, got to the end of the month and they had $20 left. Wow, sounds like my account. Perfect. Accounts receivable, yeah, okay. Inventory, not much there. Accounts, I'm just looking for stuff here that's maybe important. Total fixed assets, Erie's a big company, right? And they invested a lot in plant improvements, so it's kind of interesting. Of course, they've introduced some new products and whatnot, so that's not surprising. And yet, not all that huge in terms of total equity. Bigger than a couple of these companies that are just tiny, and Digby's relatively small too, but quite a bit smaller than Ferris and about the same size as Chester. So we come here, TQMs, Digby invested more this time. Erie scaled back on their TQM. That's interesting, but keep in mind they invested a hell of a lot in plant improvements, so possibly why they scaled back a little bit. Interest, big amounts as expected up here because they borrowed quite a bit. Andrews had a big amount, Baldwin did too, but that's because of emergency loans. Taxes, well, if you're going to make it, you got to pay it, and so Erie had a pretty big tax bill. You'll see that, again, the three teams that are probably doing the best, certainly Ferris and Erie, only two profitable teams, are not leaving capacity idle. Baldwin's got, all kinds of, got, about 1,000, 1,500 units, and then you could double that, so they've got about 6,500 units of unused capacity. Andrews, you could double there, so they got about 4,000 units of unused capacity. Okay, again, there's a huge subtlety in that expense that's hard to explain, but it is an expense. Okay, and we cruise along. We see lots of inventory, left for Andrews, especially in these three particular products. Not so much there. Huge, but again, that's because of the huge inventory. Okay, they got about a $10 margin there, but they got huge carrying costs as a result of these ones. Okay. Baker a little bit. Chester, decent amount of inventory. Digby not so much, and Erie, you know, whenever I see that little bit of inventory, then I'm always concerned that maybe they had some stock outs, and I think we'll see later that that's probably true. And I come over and look at the, you know, the various contribution margins. So, you know, Chester, this product was a traditional that's moved into the low end, and so it's got a relatively low contribution margin at this point in time. But it's got a low, you know, it's got a low automation, you know, and so, you know, that would be part of it there. You know, they got to have a low price to compete, understood, but they got low automation, and maybe some of the spending in some of the other places, you know, has kept to the, oh, what was I going to say? Lost my train of thought there, sorry. Lack of spending, I should say, in some of the other places to bring down those expenses, okay? Also, as a low-end product, still has a relatively high MTBF, right, which will affect the material costs. And age, yeah, and age is really young, which also affects the material cost. Yeah, we got some, you know, a little bit. Erie gave up quite a bit here, so in spite of doing pretty good, Erie gave up, what's that, you know, 7-8% of the traditional market, which Chester was able to take advantage of. Ferris not even competing in that market anymore. In the low end, Erie gave up a little bit there too. So in spite of sort of dominating the market, actually Chester sold a little bit more in the low end, but Erie would have had they met their potential. And Digby gave up quite a bit there. Okay, kind of an interesting spread that's going on there. Acre got advanced. It was just about out of the game last time, but because of that advancement, it probably young in terms of its age. We can take a look down here and see. Yeah, Acre got advanced, but its age is 3.6, and so that's kind of an effect. And again, still no marketing there, you know, none whatsoever. That is a wide dispersal. It's hard to believe that one product way the heck out here, feet sold in the low end sold 578. Wow, is that because of the price or something? That's kind of interesting. Why, when it's so far out here, it would have actually sold some in that low end. Huh, especially when there's products here that didn't run out, that still had some left over in inventory that were a lot lower in price. That's interesting. Huh. Sometimes I don't completely understand. Ferris dominating the high end, with Erie, though, getting a decent amount. Chester and Andrews kind of abandoning the high end. Digby picking up some scraps. Kind of the same thing here in the performance, although Erie's dominating that. And then in the size, Erie, you know, they had the same potential. But Ferris took advantage again. Erie left some money on the table. So Erie left, in spite of doing pretty well, you know, Erie probably would have dominated, except they left a bunch of money on the table in some of those categories. Maybe that's what the plant improvements was about. Maybe they needed to get some more capacity. You need to look and see. Then kind of an interesting spread here. We see teams being far more competitive with Ferris in staying out here on the front edge. Okay, Erie did some amazing comeback, and they were only able to do that because of their investment in TQM that reduced the cycle time, and that's what allowed them to move it so far ahead without getting a year, you know, too far, without getting the revision date too far forward. HR, you know, good to point out that Erie now is 115%, so they get 15% improvement in productivity. Again, that's on the labor side. That's a huge increase in productivity. Huge increase in productivity, right? Yeah, and thus lower labor costs actually. And we see some TQM investment. Digby doing some catching up there. You know, and obviously putting their investments in a couple of different places. You know, Digby not as concerned about the R&D cycle time. You know, Erie's trying to compete out there in the maybe more so, and so as a result, maybe they're more concerned about the R&D cycle time. But reductions in expenses here and there, so pretty big. And Erie still invested some, although not nearly as much as Digby or Baldwin, and not nearly as much as what they did before. So yeah, it's a the game shaping up. I'm going to be interested to see, the four teams, Andrews, Baldwin, Chester, and Digby, have dug themselves all a bit of a hole. I don't think that it's a hole that you can't get out of. I do think you can probably ease your way out of there, but it's going to take a little bit of work. So, be interested to see if they're able to do that. And while I would also say that it's not a terribly bold pursuit of strategy. The team certainly that is most boldly pursuing its strategy is the team that's being the most successful. But we actually need to look at our spreadsheet to see if that's the case, so we'll take a quick look at that. Round 5, let's make that a little bit bigger so we can all see it. Go. Yeah, I don't. The thing about it is, Erie did take on a lot of debt, and so it's going to be interesting. There's no doubt that they won the earnings per share, and no doubt that they won the ROE, contribution margin, stock price. A little doubt about those things, profits, cash flow. Digby actually did a little bit better there, but I'm wondering about deductions. And is it enough to have an impact? Ooh, yeah, they didn't have an emergency loan, so they skated by there, but they did have a deduction for leverage, lots of debt, okay, and also a deduction for working capital, okay. So they're taking on a little bit more risk, but still managed to tie, by my scorecard, tie the computer team, and took on a little leverage, which affected both this one and the working capital. You can't say that they're not kind of interrelated, right? And so that's why they ended up with those kinds of deductions. And yet one, as far as the student teams go, and tied the computer team, and I would argue are in a good position. I would argue that the other teams, the other student-run teams, have their work cut out for them at this point in time. So we'll see how you guys respond, hopefully with a bit of effort. Okay. With that, I think I'll sign off for the week and for the round, and I got it in under a half hour. That's pretty good. I hope you guys have a good week, and we'll talk to you next week.